Funny how the words, "we don't need you anymore," can sound so final right up until the moment they do. My brother-in-law said exactly that to me on a Tuesday afternoon. Not in person. Through my sister, who relayed it like she was reading from a script someone else had written for her. He says we've decided to handle things ourselves from now on. You don't need to be involved. I said, okay. That was it. Just okay. I think they expected me to cry, or argue, or show up at their door with a casserole and an apology I didn't owe. That's what I'd always done before, smooth things over, absorbed the impact, made myself smaller so the situation could feel manageable. I'd been doing it for years. I was very good at it, but that Tuesday I just said okay, and I meant it. Let me back up. My sister. I'll call her what she's always been to me, my big sister, the one I looked up to for the first 20 years of my life. Married her husband about 6 years ago. He's one of those men who walks into a room and immediately starts reorganizing it, not physically, socially. He decides very quickly who matters in a given space and who doesn't, and then he behaves accordingly. I noticed it at the wedding. I filed it away and told myself it wasn't my business. For the first couple of years, my sister and I stayed close. We talked a few times a week. We had a standing Sunday call that I genuinely looked forward to. Slowly, that call became every other week, then once a month. Then she started letting it go to voicemail and texting me later with something like, "Crazy week, can we reschedule?" We rescheduled a lot. Eventually, we stopped scheduling at all. I didn't make a big deal of it. I moved to a new city for work around that time. I'm a contracts coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company, which is a job that sounds boring but is actually just extremely detail-oriented in ways most people don't appreciate until something goes wrong. I was busy. I told myself she was busy. I told myself this was just what happened when people grew up and built separate lives. Then her husband started a business, a home renovation company. He had experience in construction, some savings, and as it turned out, a plan that required more administrative infrastructure than he'd accounted for. He was good at the physical work. He was not good at vendor contracts, insurance documentation, client agreements, or the quarterly filing requirements that came with being a licensed contractor in their state. My sister called me in a way she hadn't called me in almost 2 years. Warm. Excited. "You are literally perfect for this. You do this every day. It would only be a few hours a month." It was not a few hours a month. Within 4 months, I was managing all of their vendor contracts, drafting client agreements, keeping their certificate of insurance current, and handling the documentation for their business license renewal. I built them a filing system. I created templates so the process would be easier going forward. I did all of this on top of my actual job, on evenings and weekends, for free. Because she was my sister and he was family and I believed that's what you did. I want to be honest about something. I didn't do it out of pure selflessness. Part of me was glad to be needed again. Part of me thought this was the bridge back to the relationship I'd been missing. If I was useful, I was present. If I was present, maybe we'd find our way back to those Sunday calls. It didn't work that way. The more I did, the more it was simply expected. My brother-in-law started emailing me directly, not even through my sister, with requests. "Need the updated COI by Friday. Can you pull the Hendricks contract? They're asking about the warranty clause. The renewal is coming up. You need to file before the 15th. Not questions. Statements. Like I was an employee who had somehow never been given a schedule but was still expected to show up. When I mentioned once, gently, that I had a work deadline that week and might need an extra day on something, he told my sister I was being difficult. She texted me, "He's really stressed, can you just get it done?" I got it done. I always got it done. My nephew was born that spring. I flew out for 2 weeks to help, took PTO, covered groceries, did laundry, got up at night so my sister could sleep. I was so happy to be there. I genuinely was. Babies have a way of making everything feel like it might be okay. But even then, My brother-in-law managed to make me feel like a resource that had been temporarily redirected rather than a person who had flown across the country because she loved her family. He introduced me to his parents, who came to visit during that same week. As my wife's sister, she handles our paperwork. Not my name, just my function. I let it go. I let a lot of things go. The arrangement continued for almost 3 years. I kept their records current. I caught 2 significant errors in vendor agreements that would have cost them money. One, a renewal clause that would have auto-locked them into a rate increase. One, an insurance gap that would have left them exposed on a particular type of claim. I flagged both. My brother-in-law acknowledged neither with anything resembling gratitude. My sister said, "He's just not great at saying thank you. You know how he is." I did know how he was. I was beginning to think I'd known for a long time and had chosen not to look directly at it. Last spring, they decided to expand. A second crew, a bigger service area, a new category of work that required a separate licensing track. It was a significant undertaking, and it meant the administrative load was about to roughly double. My brother-in-law sent me a bulleted list of what would be needed going forward. It was long. It was detailed. It assumed my continued involvement as a given. I looked at that list for a long time. Then, I called my sister. I told her I was glad the business was growing and I wanted to support them, but I needed us to talk about what this role actually looked like. Whether there was some formal arrangement, some compensation, something that acknowledged the reality of what I'd been contributing. I wasn't asking to be paid retroactively. I wasn't making demands. I was asking for a conversation. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said she'd talk to him. She did talk to him. She talked to him. He talked back. And what came through to me, 3 days later, relayed again through my sister, like she was a dispatcher, was this: "He says if you're going to make it transactional, then we'd rather find someone else. He says we don't need you to make this complicated." I said I understood. Then, 2 days after that, my sister called me herself. Her voice had a specific quality I recognized, the one she used when she was delivering a verdict she didn't fully believe in, but had decided to stand behind. "I think he's right, that this has gotten complicated. Maybe it's better if we just handle things on our own from here. You don't need to be involved anymore." I said, "Okay. That's all you have to say? That's all I have to say? That's all I have to say." I think she was waiting for the part where I argued, where I cried, where I demonstrated that losing this role mattered to me enough, that I would renegotiate whatever terms were necessary to keep it. I had been reliable for so long that I think she genuinely could not imagine me as anything other than someone who would accommodate. "Okay," she said finally, uncertain. "I'll let him know." I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table for a while. Then I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was revoke their access to the shared drive where I'd stored 3 years of their business documentation. Not deleted, I'm not vindictive, but they no longer had access. That was my work. Those were my templates, my systems, my organizational structure. If they wanted to manage things independently, they could build their own. The second thing I did was contact the insurance broker I'd been working with on their behalf and let her know I was no longer the point of contact for their account. She would need to work directly with my brother-in-law going forward. I CC'd him on the email. The third thing, and this one mattered, was their business license renewal. I had been managing this process for 2 years. The renewal window was open. I was the one who had all the documentation organized, the one who knew which forms needed to be filed in which order, the one who had the account login for the licensing portal. The deadline was in 11 days. I did not file it. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't contact the licensing board. I simply stepped back from a responsibility that, as of 2 days ago, was no longer mine. They had told me they didn't need me. I believed them. I want to be clear about my own feelings in this, because I think it matters. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it, or more accurately, not doing it, because I had been told to stop. They had released me from this role. I was honoring that. If the release came with consequences they hadn't anticipated, that was a result of their decision, not mine. I went about my week. I slept better than I had in months. I went for a run Saturday morning, made a real breakfast, called a friend I hadn't talked to in too long. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a very extended period of time. On Sunday, 9 days after the conversation with my sister, my phone started ringing. The first call was from my brother-in-law, which was unusual. He almost never called me directly. I let it go to voicemail. He did not leave one. He called again an hour later. Then again. Then my sister called. Then my brother-in-law called twice more. By Sunday evening, I had 17 missed calls between the two of them. My sister had also sent 4 text messages, escalating in urgency. The first one said, "Hey, can you call me when you get a chance?" The fourth one said, "This is serious. Please call me back." I did not call back. Monday, the calls continued. My brother-in-law also emailed me, subject line urgent, explaining that they had gone to file the business license renewal themselves and discovered that the documentation was incomplete, that the portal required information they didn't have, and that the deadline was in 2 days. He needed my help. He was asking me to step back in, just for this, just to get them through the renewal, and then they would take it from there. I read the email. I thought about the 3 years. I thought about she handles our paperwork. I thought about my sister's voice when she said maybe it was better if I wasn't involved anymore, and how certain she had sounded, and how little room there had been in that certainty for the version of me that had spent evenings and weekends building the system they were now drowning without. I did not respond to the email. By Tuesday morning I had 31 missed calls. My mother called Wednesday. This surprised me. My sister had clearly looped her in, which meant the situation had escalated enough that outside reinforcements were being recruited. My mother and I have a cordial relationship. Not close, but functional. She left a voicemail that was gentle in tone and very clearly had been thought through in advance. She talked about family, about how these things happened, about how she was sure I understood the pressure they were under. She said she hoped I would do the right thing. I thought about what the right thing was for a long time. Then I thought about the fact that no one, not my sister, not my brother-in-law, not my mother in this voicemail, had said the word sorry. Not once. Not in any of the 31 calls or the text messages or the urgent email. They had described the problem. They had asked for help. They had implied that helping was the right thing to do. But no one had acknowledged that the reason they were in this situation was that they had dismissed me, and that they had been dismissing me, and that they had been dismissing me in various ways for years. On Wednesday afternoon, my brother-in-law's assistant, a young woman who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, and who I felt genuinely bad for, sent me an email that had clearly been dictated by him, asking if I had any documentation that could help expedite the renewal process. I replied to her directly, not to him. I said I was no longer involved with the account and suggested she contact the licensing board directly for guidance on late or incomplete renewals. I kept it professional. It wasn't her fault. Thursday, 1 day before the deadline, my sister sent me a text that was different from the others. Shorter. No logistical information, no timeline, no request. Just, I know I haven't been a good sister. I'm sorry. Please call me. I stared at that text for a long time. I called her. She cried almost immediately. She said she knew how much I had done for them. She said she had let him speak for both of them for too long, and that she was ashamed of it. She said the way this had all unfolded was not okay, and that she had known it wasn't okay for a while, and had not done anything about it, and that she was sorry for that too. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was real, though. I could hear the difference. I told her I appreciated it. I told her I had needed to hear it. Then she asked, very quietly, if I could help them with the renewal. I told her I wouldn't be stepping back into the role I'd had before. That was finished, but I would send her the login credentials for the portal and a document I'd already drafted. Because of course I drafted it. I'm detail-oriented, it's just how I'm wired. That walked through exactly what they needed to file and in what order. I would give her the tools. What they did with them was up to them. She said thank you. And then, like she hadn't said it in a very long time, she said she loved me. I told her I loved her too. I meant it. I also meant everything else. They filed on time. Barely, from what I understand, but they managed it. My brother-in-law has not apologized. I don't expect him to. People like him rarely do. Not because they're incapable of recognizing when they've been wrong, but because they've built an entire self-image on never being wrong. And dismantling that would require a kind of courage they haven't had to develop. I don't hate him. I genuinely don't, but I am done being useful to him in ways that cost me something. My sister and I have talked 3 times since then. Real conversations, not logistical ones. She asked me once, carefully, if I would ever consider being involved with the business again in any capacity. I told her that if there was ever a formal, compensated arrangement, a real one, with a contract, because I know how to write those, I would consider it. She said she thought that was fair. I don't know where things go from here. Families are complicated. Relationships survive things they maybe shouldn't, and collapse over things that shouldn't matter, and sometimes they just slowly change shape until you're not sure what you're looking at anymore. What I know is that, for 3 years, I made myself essential and invisible at the same time. And I let that be enough. Because some part of me thought that was the price of belonging. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. And the moment I stopped paying it, everything became very clear, very quickly. Both what I had been worth to them and what I was worth to myself. 31 missed calls in 4 days. They knew. They had always known. They just assumed I wouldn't. I've thought a lot about why I waited so long. 3 years is not a short time. 3 years of evenings and weekends, of being the person who caught the errors no one else was looking for, of building something carefully and watching someone else take credit for the stability it created. I've asked myself why I kept showing up, and I think the honest answer is that I confused being needed with being valued. Those are not the same thing. I know that now in a way I didn't before. And I think that's the only version of growth that actually sticks, the kind that comes from lived experience rather than something you read and nodded at and then forgot. What happened with my sister and her husband followed a pattern I didn't have the vocabulary for at the time, but I understand it clearly now. When you consistently absorb the cost of someone else's disorganization, you don't earn their respect. You confirm their assumption that the cost will always be absorbed. The dynamic doesn't shift because you work harder or give more. It shifts when you stop. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ultimatums, just stop. The consequences that follow are not something you created. They are something that was always there, waiting, held at bay by your continued willingness to prevent them. That distinction matters to me. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I set out to honor what they had told me, which was that I was no longer needed. Honoring, that wasn't cruelty. It was intelligence, and I think there's something worth sitting with in the idea that doing nothing, simply removing yourself from a situation you were explicitly told you weren't needed in, can be the most clarifying action available. It requires a certain kind of quiet confidence to do that. To not explain, not justify, not show up anyway out of habit or guilt or the fear of being seen as difficult. My sister apologized. That mattered. Not because it changed the 3 years, but because it was real, I could hear it, and because it opened a door to something different going forward. My brother-in-law didn't apologize, and I've made my peace with that too. Some people are not in a place where accountability is accessible to them. That's not my problem to solve. My job is to know my own worth clearly enough that I don't keep subsidizing the comfort of people who have decided not to see it. The thing about integrity is that it's expensive in the short term and cheap in the long run. Every time I chose not to say something, not to ask for what I deserved, not to put a formal structure around what I was contributing, I was paying a price I couldn't see clearly because I was paying it in small installments over a long period of time. By the time the bill came due, it was larger than I'd realized. That's how it works. The cost of silence compounds. 31 missed calls in 4 days. I didn't need to say a word. The numbers said everything.